And that's all for your daily war report, folks. Our boys continue to fight the good fight to bring freedom back to Europe and across the Pacific. Before we wrap up, just a reminder to tend to your war gardens, buy your war bonds if you haven't already, and produce. Every little bit counts to help the Allies defeat Hitler and the Japanese Empire. Last but not least, be careful what you say or write, because remember, loose lips sink ships.
Welcome back, historians. What do you think the broadcaster meant when he said, "Loose lips sink ships"? Well, if you're thinking it has something to do with the First Amendment, then you're right on track. As World War II raged on abroad, a more subtle conflict was taking place on the home front, the battle between freedom and security. Today, we'll be focusing on 4 important freedoms as we answer our less than essential question: to what extent were the First Amendment protections limited during World War II? Let's look at the questions that will guide us along the way. To what extent were the following freedoms limited during World War II? Speech, assembly, press, and religious freedoms. All right, let's dive in. Many Americans found that their right to dissent was better protected during World War II than it was during World War I. During World War I, dissent was often met with severe penalties and restrictions due to the Espionage Act of 1917, which outlawed actions that disrupted military activities or supported U.S. adversaries. The Sedition Act of 1918 tightened these restrictions further, making it illegal to even criticize the government, the war, or the military. Yet by the time of the Second World War, the Sedition Act had been repealed, and the U.S. government was invoking the Espionage Act less frequently for simply criticizing the government for war-related activities. But just because criticism was tolerated didn't mean it was always received with open arms. The U.S. government and media clearly defined who America's enemies were abroad, but it wasn't quite clear at home. For example, in 1940, Congress passed the Smith Act, which criminalized advocating for the overthrow of the government and required all non-citizens over the age of 14 to register with the government. Although it was initially used to target those who were seen as having pro-fascist or pro-Nazi opinions, eventually it was used to target individuals and groups who were critical of the war. By the end of the 1940s, the federal government was using it to target socialists, communists, and individuals of any ideologies that it felt was a threat to national security or American values. But the courts didn't always side with the federal government in these cases. In Schneiderman v. United States, the Supreme Court staunchly rejected the federal government's attempt to take away William Schneiderman's American citizenship simply because of his communist affiliations. Aside from legislation, there were also more subtle pressures on free speech. Propaganda campaigns used slogans like "loose lips sink ships" to get their message across. Phrases like these encouraged people to self-censor or censor others by insinuating that their ideas, whatever they may be, might hurt the American war effort and impact their own safety on the home front. Let's stop and complete the graphic organizer for this section before we move on. The next freedom that saw its protections evolve was freedom of assembly, or the individual's right to come together with others to collectively express and defend common interests. This right often clashed with national security concerns and societal prejudices. Let's look at an example you learned about during your American fashion lesson back in Unit 8. During the Zoot Suit riots of 1943 in Los Angeles, animosities between Mexican-American youth and U.S. military servicemen bubbled over into violent confrontations. Young Latinos and other minorities who wore zoot suits were often portrayed as unpatriotic. So when white servicemen and off-duty policemen began beating hundreds of Mexican-American youth and taking away their suits, many on-duty police officers encouraged the violence, even arresting the victims who had been attacked. Prejudice and national security concerns also manifested in the internment of Japanese Americans, which you learned about earlier. Labor movements felt the strain of limited assembly rights during the war as well. The Roosevelt administration encouraged a no-strike pledge, which asked unions to refrain from strikes to prevent disruption in war production. This limited workers' rights to gather and protest for better conditions, wages, or benefits. When they did strike, they faced public and governmental backlash for being unpatriotic. Before we move on, let's complete this section in the graphic organizer. The next freedom we'll dive into is freedom of the press. The press played a complex role during World War II, tasked with keeping the public informed, yet also wary of jeopardizing the nation's security or being harassed by the federal government. Journalists and media outlets found themselves at a crossroads. Amidst the urgency of the war, an unspoken pact evolved between the government and much of the press. Many media outlets, out of a sense of duty and fear, subscribed to the idea that loose lips sink ships, and held back certain information. Yet many journalists risked their lives to bring back stories from the war front. They painted vivid tales of the horrors and heroes of the war for those back home. And some journalists, like Ernie Pyle, lost their lives on the battlefield in their attempts to document the war. But on the same pages of these harrowing accounts, newspapers would also pen narratives that incorporated government-sanctioned perspectives, towing the line between objective reporting and propaganda. The long shadows of the Smith Act and the Espionage Act loomed large. Publications that were labeled disloyal faced the potential of governmental harassment, additional investigation, or even prosecution. One example took place in 1942, when an article about the Battle of Midway in the Chicago Tribune hinted that the U.S. military had broken the Japanese naval codes. The story described the Japanese plan in such detail that it implied the U.S. Navy must have had some advanced knowledge of the enemy's strategy, and shared that knowledge with journalists. The government was furious and investigated the paper for violating the Espionage Act. But concerned about the attention the prosecution of a newspaper would bring and the potential threat of confirming to the Japanese that they had indeed broken their codes, the government decided not to indict the paper. Incidents like these led many newspapers to think twice about what information they published. Let's stop and review before we move on to our last freedom. Last but not least, the context of the war also tested America's commitment to religious freedoms. The Jehovah's Witnesses, a relatively small Christian group at the time, found themselves at the heart of this conflict. Their steadfast beliefs, particularly their refusal to salute the flag or engage in military service, made them targets of public animosity and legal action. In the 1940 Minersville School District versus Gobitis case, the court upheld a public school district's policy requiring students to salute the flag and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The court did so over the objections of Jehovah's Witnesses, who argued that saluting the flag was the same as worshiping a religious figure or statue. However, in 1943, the Supreme Court overruled this decision in the West Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett case, arguing that the First Amendment establishes the right for all Americans to refrain from such patriotic displays on religious or personal grounds. But Jehovah's Witnesses weren't the only religious group that had their rights tested. Japanese American Buddhists also dealt with harassment. Because of their racial identities and religious beliefs, they faced scrutiny and persecution. For example, Buddhist temples were some of the first places the FBI raided after the Pearl Harbor attack. Many Buddhist leaders were arrested and sent to camps run by the Department of Justice, not the internment camps that would come later. Throughout the period of Japanese internment, many of the Buddhist temples were left behind and were vandalized by looters or taken over by local residents and authorities. In most cases, the US government did nothing to prevent the vandalism or seizures of the temples. Like the war itself, the fight to protect religious freedoms was complex. Before we wrap up, let's complete our last graphic organizer. As we reflect on the turbulent times of World War II, it's evident the battle on the home front between freedom and security was fierce. The First Amendment faced many challenges, revealing the delicate balance between civil liberties and national priorities. These examples provide important lessons that we can use to ensure we always strive to protect our freedoms, even in times of war or conflict. Okay, historians, until next time, keep making history.
Hey!